Welcome to the Green Alliance podcast. We are the charity and think tank dedicated to achieving ambitious leadership for the environment. I'm Holly Brazier Tope, Head of Politics at Green Alliance. It's officially been 100 days since the new Labour government took office, following over a decade of Conservative leadership. In today's episode, we'll look back at some key moments from these first months and consider how the groundwork laid so far could shape what comes next. We'll be hearing from some Green Alliance experts, as well as a couple of Labour MPs that are passionate about climate and nature, to gain an insider view from Westminster on how they feel things are progressing. I'm here with Chris Venables, Director of Politics at Green Alliance, to talk about the first 100 days. How do you think it's gone?
Good question. Been thinking a lot about that over the last week or two. I think if you're Keir Starmer or you're Rachel Reeves or you're a senior staffer in this government, probably you think it hasn't gone that well. There was a poll this week from More in Common that put this Labour government at 1 point ahead. That's a pretty significant and serious drop from the 4th of July and that election day. So yeah, probably not looking good. Some great stuff has happened too, but a big picture, I think I'd be a bit disappointed and a bit worried if I was them.
I think not good. It's a fair summary. I think lots of people felt very positive at the very beginning. A new government that put loads of shadow ministers into ministerial roles, and there was expertise that was transitioning into government, and people were really excited about what that meant. But actually what we've seen in the first 3 months is a divided number 10 that's obviously culminated this week in the departure of Sue Gray and a new chief of staff within the first 100 days, which is fairly unprecedented, and myriad scandals around gifts and all that kind of thing, when it was meant to be pitched as a serious government that was breaking away from governments past. I think there are some fairly existential questions now from Labour on what they stand for. Yeah. They've decided to hold strong on things like the 2-child benefit cap and the cutting of the winter fuel payment, which I think has surprised quite a lot of people, because it's just part of a narrative where actually you're making really hard decisions, but you're not providing anything positive. There's nothing that you're fighting for. So I think that is what has seen for Sue Gray, really, and the hope is for Keir Starmer that Morgan McSweeney is going to turn that around and inject some kind of political narrative into it.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, I mean, I think in many ways, power is really centralised in number 10 and the Treasury, and MPs have been pretty unwilling to kind of go behind the whip or challenge the government, even kind of signing on letters and things like that. They're all quite cautious about it. So I think it'll be interesting to see if that changes after this kind of week of a quite big wobble. But yeah, the power is at the top, and I guess they're still working out what they want to do with it.
And I think it's not talked about enough, the fact people talk about the lads that are in power, and I think that needs to be delved into slightly more, because that is hands down one of the reasons Sue Gray left number 10. That is there any difference in the Labour Party now compared to previous governments, where we actually see men that really want to be in charge, and it's not necessarily the constructive way of governing that Keir Starmer wanted it to be, or claimed to want it to be before the election. I think, moving on slightly to obviously more of our agenda on climate and nature stuff, actually with the mission-based approach, Ed Miliband has been allowed to have the best start. He's absolutely loving life. He's been described by a civil servant as a Duracell bunny. What do you think that means?
I think he's having a great time, that's right. And I think that's clear from all his social media videos in Brazil and kind of visiting wind farms, sites around the UK. He's out there. I think he genuinely seems to feel like they've got a very positive story to tell. And that was clear in his conference speech as well, where he's like, hey, us being in power really matters, and here's what we're doing. I think that should give the environmental sector and the environmental movement a bit of heart, and it's not totally limited to Ed. If you look at what Lou Haig's doing on the transport brief, some really great announcements around electric buses, public transport. She's clearly interested in active travel. What Matt Pennycook and Angela Rayner are doing on planning, seeming to kind of listen to the concerns of the environmental movement, wanting to kind of build those new towns well and do the housing energy infrastructure well. I suppose the kind of dysfunction at the top, as it were, stands a bit in stark contrast to Ed and to Lou and two others kind of seeming to turn up every day and crack on and get the job done. And I think that is obviously hugely inspiring. And for those of us who've been working on things a while, great to see. I suppose the kind of question around all of it is you can run at regulation, you can run at law, you can run at announcements, you can create task forces left, right and centre, unless the Treasury, Rachel Reeves, is willing to spend money, that could quickly run out of road. So that question I still feel like we're grappling with, of how they're going to approach the finances, and some of the big spend we need to see on nature recovery, on public transport specifically as well, on insulation. There's all these different areas where without that dosh, we're just not going to get that kind of step change that I think lots of us want. I think that's true. But yeah, I don't know how you think about the Treasury, think about Rachel Reeves, and kind of think about how that's gone. It's been quite a confused message in a way. There's no money. Oh, but we're going to maybe tweak the fiscal rules and find 50 billion quid. So I think there's some big questions there around their strategy and their approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Treasury have gone incredibly hard on the fact that there's this terrible inheritance, which when I've spoken to multiple spats that say any new government would be mad not to do that. But actually, I think that they've gone well overboard, and they've actually terrified a lot of their own MPs rather than providing a sort of way for them to govern in the future. They're not providing anything else. It's just this scaremongering message of the fact that actually there's no money, they're not going to be able to do anything. What does that mean for manifesto commitments? Where does that stand? Then you start talking about all these fiscal rules things. And I think it does come back to the fact that they decided to leave the budget for so long. The end of October, the 30th of October, when you come into power in July, I totally understand you need to leave enough time for the OBR to make their assessments, but there was absolutely no need for that. And I think it's left a massive void for ministers and MPs to be able to talk about the vision. And I think that's so much of it. And I think there's a bit of a question about the first few weeks had incredibly quick action on things like lifting the onshore wind ban, setting up the AR6 auction for renewables, setting up GB Energy, that kind of thing. Isn't that all the low-hanging fruit? Isn't that the easy stuff that everyone wanted to see, that they promised in a new government that's really easy to do, is just changing some little bits of regulation and legislation? Is that the exciting stuff? And now actually we're just into the really difficult stuff?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I guess I'm thinking, as you talk about that big flagship piece of legislation early next year, the planning bill, which for many in government that we hear is kind of definitional or pretty pivotal moment for them in being able to actually unlock some of the changes they want to see. So I think that's right, that they still have some pretty big political fights to have. When stuff starts getting built, houses, energy infrastructure, that's where some of the backlash could come. And I think on the Treasury thing, I think it's kind of interesting that party conference was that point where they felt they needed to start briefing that they were up for finding kind of ways to invest. And I think that's also kind of reflected also in Steve Reed and the DEFRA department, where they are talking a good talk on nature. Kind of nature is in crisis is Steve Reed's mantra, and the environmental movement kind of is delighted to hear that kind of clear statement of intent. But with the review of the environmental improvement plan, with him reframing DEFRA as a growth department, which is kind of interesting. I think there's still that big question as we head into the budget, and crucially into the big 3-year spending review, which is where do these guys decide to put the money? And is it in the right stuff and in the right way? And I think those are all the battles that we're just in the foothills of. And I suppose on that front, I think we have to give them the benefit of the doubt and a bit of space, because there's some, as we know, some really difficult questions around how you spend money in the right way, whether that's in the farming budget, whether that's in how you construct a energy efficiency scheme. Those haven't famously gone well in the past. So I think there's still quite a lot of space there that we should give them to try and, define what this is about and be propositional about that.
I think moving it on slightly to where the other parties are. So now obviously we've got the Conservatives in opposition. We've got a massively beefed up Lib Dems caucus in Parliament, and we've quadrupled the number of Greens. Party conferences were incredibly interesting in showing us where the atmosphere in those parties are. And I think the excitement at Lib Dems and Greens were absolutely palpable. That's really nice to see. And the idea of constructive opposition was being hammered home. But equally, people that used to be in number 10, so ex-Tory spads, have also talked about the fact that they think this implosion of government in the first few months was inevitable, because actually governing is incredibly hard. Where do you think the Conservatives are right now? Obviously, they're focusing entirely on a leadership race and haven't been able to provide, arguably, that useful opposition, which is why they're there. But do you think that matters?
I think it definitely does matter, because if you can build, and it really matters on our agenda, if you can build a coalition on the right to challenge the government on some of its main agendas, whether that's planning reform or climate, then you start to create a serious headache for Ed Miliband and for Keir Starmer. The Telegraph currently has an article kind of that it writes itself every day around how the net zero threat as, about to dismantle the entire of the British economy overnight kind of thing. And if you can start to build parliamentary moments around that, if you can start to unite a party, then I think that could be quite challenging. But on the Lib Dems, I think they are really excited. I haven't seen them yet point themselves at things that feel like the kind of right things. I think they can often feel quite kind of small issues that, I'm thinking about the GB Energy bill where they're going to table amendment on, I think, on a duty around nature. And that's useful and important, but probably the big fights are much bigger around the scope and scale of their ambition on energy, etc. So I think it's all there to be shaped. But you were at our Tory party conference, Holly. So what's your take on the current state of play there?
Really, the main thing that environmentalists at Conservative Party conference was saying was actually they're really pleased that there hasn't been a focus on net zero, because actually the only way that it was going to be included was as a dividing line, which is a dangerous place for us to be. So actually its exclusion is a fundamentally good thing at this particular point. But what we do need to make sure is that when the new leader is chosen, that we help them understand the benefits of this, and again providing the constructive opposition to some of the ideas that the Labour government are going to try and put through in the coming years. They all represent very different constituencies, and the needs of rural and urban constituencies in this country are very different, and it's important to represent all of those views and have an educated and sensible dialogue about it. So it'll be very interesting to see where that goes. Should we try and end on a slightly optimistic note?
Yeah, I think there is lots to be optimistic about. I still think that the mission and the climate mission is this huge opportunity for us to really drive at a whole bunch of changes. I think you can read into some of the areas where they have taken flack and they have dug into decisions that were unpopular and say, these guys are willing to take political risks because they do want to deliver. And for all the pros and cons of the winter fuel payment, there is a legitimate argument around trying to prioritise that spending. So I think for me, my kind of overall feeling is this is a government that wants to deliver, that wants to be re-elected in 2029, that wants to be able to point to a bunch of stuff and say, hey, we did that. And I think you could look at pretty much everything the environmental movement wants to say, if you could do that, and if you could do it well, that's stuff that could be vote winning. And that's a huge opportunity for us. I think our challenge is how to persuade your kind of Morgan McSweeney's and your Pat McFaddens that this green stuff isn't this kind of eco-loony warrior stuff over there, but it's kind of serious economic and social policy. So that's where I'd probably find my hope.
I love that hope. I think my hope is entirely based on, the idea that missions will be cutting across government departments. It's something that we have seen for many years, if not decades, actually not work in government, not work in Whitehall. The fact that things don't cut across departments when they should. It's not just a DESNZ problem. It needs to go so much further than a Miliband. And that does include nature. Where does nature sit? We're eternally told that it's part of the energy mission. Is it? How's that going to work? So I think the missions are the hope piece because they cut across so many different departments, and what we need to see is a really joined up approach from all the ministers showing that they want a way forward for the country, because things are pretty bad and have been pretty bad for the last few months. So hopefully things will get better. So now that we've touched on some of the key events from the past 100 days from Green Alliance's office overlooking Westminster, I thought it was about time to go into the inside. So I'm here in Portcullis House to talk to Clive Lewis, Labour MP for Norwich South, and a passionate advocate for action on climate, to get his view on how things are going in Westminster. How do you think the first 100 days have gone?
Oh,
small question.
Yeah, just how have they gone? It's a tale of two very different sides, isn't it? Because on one side you've got the headlines that I think most people remember, which are things about winter fuel payments, two-child benefit, freebies and corporate giveaways. And those are the things that have dominated. And I think when you're a new government, you come in with a kind of aura of let's roll our sleeves up, let's get stuff done. And that was very much the energy that, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, wanted to channel. But it kind of fell apart pretty quick. But I think if you can get below the headlines, there are some things for not just policy wonk, but there are some things that we've done. And there are certain departments that have done really well. And one of them is DESNZ and Ed Miliband's team. And they've really hit the ground running. And I think, perhaps partly because Ed has been in government before, he knows how the machinery of government works, he knows how the blob works. He's been able to cut through in a way that perhaps some of his newer colleagues haven't. So if you think about GB Energy, If you think about the new renewables auction, which saw a 50% increase in the number of renewables available in that auction, you can look at the national grid that's been partly nationalised. I know that was started under the last government, but that's now happened, and they're going to be like kind of controlling many of the difficulties and working out how we're going to kind of feed in all that renewable energy. The warm homes plan and the upgrade for social housing and rented housing, bringing it up to category C. So they've really hit the ground running. And I think that that's something that we should all applaud. I think it's fair to say the last government, particularly when they first came into power in 2010, I think when they came into power, it was vote blue, go green or something like that. And they had the green tree with the blue background. And there were some hiccups in terms of stopping onshore wind and so on. But they actually did try to get onto the curve of renewables, get onto the curve of that kind of sentiment from the public that we wanted to tackle the climate crisis. But as that party and different prime ministers changed as it went on, it lost its way and it became regressive, and it actually, frankly, became anti-progress on this issue. So Labour have come in and they've picked up on some of those projects, but they've also driven with the new energy, especially on GB energy and so on in that area. So it is a mixed story, but there are some good things in there.
I mean, obviously Parliament is absolutely full of new MPs, right? Not just Labour, but across all parties. How has that changed the vibe here? Everyone talks about how excited they are and how much they want to get involved. How does that feel for someone that was here already?
I think it's good. So they've come with a real energy. They've come with a real sense of, I'm not going to say purpose, but a real sense that they've brought a new vitality to the place. A lot of the people who were, wiped out were Conservatives, older Conservatives very often. And, if you speak to the door staff, they'll say, man, this place feels new, it feels fresh. It's a cultural shift, a modal shift even, here in Parliament. And so that's a good thing. And so when you put on events here in Parliament now, I did a day on water, and we got 80 MPs to the drop-in. Now, that's unprecedented. I mean, I've been here now 10 years, and that's never happened. But that's because people are new and enthusiastic, and they're like, they're new, and they're looking around at everything, and it's like, oh, I'll have a bit of this, I'll have a bit of that. So that's the really good stuff.
You've already touched on a number of the big kind of early wins on climate, particularly, that obviously Ed has come in very keen. He removed the onshore wind ban. This idea of a clean power mission that's sitting across government. I mean, do you think he's got the political support that he needs from Parliament itself? And do you think people are behind the mission?
I think it's mixed. One of the problems for the Labour government is that they ran a fantastic campaign to get elected. But to get elected, they tied themselves into some pretty dire fiscal constraints. The orthodoxy of the Treasury is very conservative and hawkish. And this is we're talking about modal shifts. We're talking about a complete transformation of our economy that needs to happen. And the Treasury needs to fund that. And at the same time, the Treasury is kind of dominated by this fiscal conservatism. The two don't go together. So I think the will from Ed is there, and the team and many MPs and the public and businesses and civil society. But there are some blocks there in government, and I would say the Treasury is potentially one of them where that's difficult. Now, that's not just the Treasury. It's also because we've inherited a really bad economic situation from the Conservatives. That's part of it. But we've got to deal with that and also, maintain hope amongst the public that things can change for the better.
Talking about the Treasury, under the last Labour leader, you're obviously doing work on sustainable economics. Are you knocking at an open door there? Do you think there's any hope for the work that you were doing?
In a nutshell, no. Look, so where it feels to me, where we're landing on a kind of what people call green growth. It's a euphemism for growth, basically, with some green bits attached to it. So we'll build some wind turbines, some offshore wind, some photovoltaics, some solar farms. There will be green elements in there, but actually this is the growth agenda. And I think we all know that it's not just a climate crisis, it's also an ecological crisis. And the whole point about sustainable economics was I was a Treasury minister, and at the heart of Treasury, which in many ways runs government, Number 10 might disagree with that, but in many ways runs government. We wanted to put sustainability at the heart of economic decision making, and I don't think that's happening.
We've already touched on part of this, but what do you think the key things are that you would like to see in the next Parliament in terms of climate and nature? What are you positive about? What do you think could happen?
So I'd like to see a bill on ownership and deep adaptation for water, and I'd like it as a template for other critical sectors of the economy and our society. I think deep adaptation has to be something that everyone is familiar with. We are entering into uncharted territory, and mitigation, in many ways, we missed the boat on 1.5. I think most people accept that now, and we always knew that once you went past 1.5, heading into 2 and 2 and above, which is where most scientists the consensus we're heading and possibly higher, you're looking at adaptation. And that's where I think we now really need to talk to. And that means, I want to see proper funding for home retrofitting. These new towns, these new houses that we're building. I know we've got the YIMBYs in my party, the yes to growth. Well, let's make it sustainable growth, if there's such a term. But let's make sure that these new towns and small cities that we're going to build are actually sustainable, not just as communities, which is critical, but also as ecological parts of our ecosystem. Don't build on floodplains. You shouldn't be using fresh water to flush those toilets. They shouldn't need to be retrofitted either. So I know we're going to make sure the standards are pretty high, but they need to be going further and faster. I'd like to see that. I'd also like to see us play our role. David Lammy, in a recent lecture, talked about climate being centre of all the government does. Let's lead the way on debt cancellation. Let's lead the way on technology transfers. Let's really drive forward as a progressive Labour government and show the United States and other countries, in the G7 and G20, this is how we're going to help the Global South make the jump over dirty fuels and so on. So we really need to get a grip of that. I also want to see our government take into account, if you're going to build these gigafactories for electric vehicles, what are we thinking about sub-Saharan Africa and the countries that provide those materials? Why aren't these countries as rich as Saudi Arabia? These are the social justice issues that we should be thinking about. And this is how I think a Labour government can kind of really go on the front foot. And I think if you're doing good stuff internationally, it also kind of opens a space for what you can do domestically as well. So I'd like to see a bit more of that as well, a bit more global leadership.
Does that mean you're feeling positive about the upcoming COPs? Labour have been very overt in the fact that they want that to be a big moment for both Prime Minister and Secretaries of State to show that we are serious on a world stage.
I'd like to see success at COP, but then I look at the rest of the world and I look how everyone seems to be arming and gearing up for the worst. And that doesn't seem to me to be something that goes well with a kind of climate agreement, which is going to require political and economic trust and cooperation. I hope I'm wrong, but I think you've got to be realistic. COP has become synonymous with failure. We knew about this really publicly in the 1980s, early 90s. We've been at this for like 35 years. And we're still pumping out billions of tons of carbon. I would like to see the Labour government undo the licences for the oil sector, the new licences. There's no need for that. It's good that we've stopped extra exploration. I hope COP can deliver something, but I think, when you look at it in the context of the broader international situation, it does look pretty grim.
Well, fairly bleak note to end on, but thank you so much for your time. It's such an interesting insight to how things are. And, maybe we'll talk again in a few months and see where we're at. It felt like my conversation with Clive was left a bit unfinished as to the future and possible ways forward. So I sat down with Olivia Blake, Labour MP for Sheffield Hallam, to talk about how she thinks the first few months have gone and where the opportunities might be for this government on climate and nature in the years ahead. Olivia, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. How do you think the first 100 days have gone for the new government?
Well, I think, it was really exciting getting in and winning and being back here. I've really been enjoying being back in Parliament. But, it's kind of been a bit of a strange start because we've had so many recesses. We had the summer recess and then the conference recess. So I haven't really felt like we've had 100 days of a Labour government yet because we haven't had that kind of legislative time. But, we've already done some amazing things. I'm on the Energy Bill Committee. So we met for the first time this week to talk about setting up GB Energy, which has been really exciting to have a publicly owned energy company being set up as the first piece of legislation. I think that's great and a good sign of where we want to go. We've also seen some good decisions. So, like scrapping the Rwanda plan, dropping the government's opposition to the Rosebank lawsuit that's going through at the minute, and also things like stopping the ban on onshore wind, which is really great, and the recent offshore wind bid as well. We had like a huge amount more energy that's going to be produced through that, which is really fantastic to see. We've also had some broader transport policies, which are obviously really important for the kind of climate crisis as well. So on buses, 500 million for electric buses, which is fantastic. And the setting up of municipal bus companies and bus control coming through as well. And also the setting up of GB railways as well. So I think it's really exciting. Obviously, there's been some horrific stuff that's happened in the first 100 days, like the riots and the impact that's had on communities up and down the country. And, we're still finding our feet in government and getting used to not being in opposition. So I'm hoping that the next 100 days will be where people really see what an impact Labour government will make.
I mean, you've listed a very exciting array of things that have happened, particularly in the climate energy space. It has not all been smooth sailing politically, to say the least. Where do you think people sit on that? I suppose in part a question about what the vibe is in Parliament. You know, there's loads of new MPs, both Labour MPs, but also from many other parties. So how do you think the kind of negative news side of things and the public perception is landing here?
I think it's quite interesting because I kind of almost feel like you kind of come to work expecting it to be the same after you've won an election, and it literally no 1 in 3 people. Like, it's such a changed Parliament, and you can kind of see that and feel that just like when you're walking around. You know, there's a fair few less boys in suits. There's definitely a change in kind of in the look of Parliament and feel of Parliament, and it does feel a bit more representative in those terms, so that's great. But I think that means that there's a lot of people who are learning the ropes, and it does kind of feel like that's another reason that things are slow to start. And also, you know, difficult decisions that we've been having to make, and that puts a lot of pressure on people. So it's quite a lonely place, Westminster. If you don't have a team around you, a lot of these new MPs will be coming in, building their teams and things like that. It can be a tough place, but, you know, it's also a great place to work in many ways despite that. But I think being in the bubble a bit more is a problem, which is why I like spending so much time in my constituency.
I mean, you talk about it being a bit of a lonely place. I suppose that is a useful segue into, if you think about some of the stuff that ministers have been doing in their first few months, so particularly looking at Steve Reid and Ed Miliband on our agenda, do you think that they've got kind of the political support that they need to further what they're trying to do? Do you think there is a political kind of consensus within the Labour Party about taking the climate and nature crises seriously?
I think so. And, you know, that's obviously clear from having a mission on energy, and we really need to get that right and quickly. But that can't be the only thing we do on the climate, which is why I think, you know, the transport policies are really important as well. And, you know, obviously Steve Reid has inherited a massive issue with our water system, which all nature starts with water, sunlight and a bit of oxygen for good measure. But it's really important that we kind of look after those ecosystems, and we've already seen some of the changes that we're bringing in through that, which I think is a real opportunity to kind of show that we are different from the Conservatives and will prioritise these issues and actually hold people to account when they are failing and when they are polluting. We've seen significant fines just this week, which is going back into the pockets of water ratepayers. That's progress, but there's still so much to do, and we have hopefully up to 5 years in this Parliament to really get a grip of these issues, because we can't fix one without fixing the other. And it's really important that we kind of are all working collectively to tackle this international crisis that is definitely hitting home with the floods that we've seen recently, with the storms that are gathering in America at the moment. It's really clear how unstable the climate already is. We're not talking about 5 years or 10 years or 20 years away. We're talking about here and now, and what we need to do to build resilience in our communities and actually tackle that, as well as trying to prevent the worst effects of climate crisis in the future.
With that in mind, I mean, the scale of the crisis is one thing, but people so often view Parliament as a really partisan, very party political place. With the scale of the challenge in the front of your mind, do you think that with a Labour Party and a new government, do you think that there is going to be that kind of cross-party consensus and wanting and willingness to work with other parties to try and do what we can to mitigate the worst effects?
I really hope so. And I'm on the Energy Bill Committee, as you say, and we had a witness session this week. And it was really interesting because all the witnesses seem to be really kind of welcoming of GB Energy, which you might not expect from across the witnesses that we were kind of talking to, from, you know, trade unions to business leaders to association leaders and environmental groups as well. Like, most of it was quite positive, which was really good. So I'm hoping that colleagues across the floor heard that in that discussion. But there's obviously more we need to do and focus on. This was a very, very narrow bill. Yeah. It's probably, compared to the last energy bill I sat on, which took us hours and hours and hours, I probably saw the minister more than I saw my family during that process, because there were so many sessions. This is very, very tight. So, you know, it's just the beginning, and that's exciting because it's already a significant step change from the last government, but it's kind of what that then unlocks and what the potential is for future legislation that I find most exciting about it. I also think that there is more room to work across parties as backbenchers, and I'm really looking forward to working with different APPGs on those issues, whether that's nature, wildlife, or more to focus less on the environment and more on energy and other issues. I think we also need to talk about the impacts of carbon that aren't in the energy sector as well, because, you know, that's one part of it, but we've got a whole range of different issues, whether it's agriculture or products, even creation of products and things like that. There's a huge way to go and a lot to go at, and I kind of feel like there is that energy behind Labour at the moment to crack on, and I think we've seen that in the first 100 days, and hopefully we'll continue to see that throughout Parliament.
I mean, what about, we've obviously got biodiversity and climate COPs coming up in the next couple of months. It's great that we've seen already that the prime ministers and secretaries of state really want to go and show that Britain are serious on the international stage. What do you think that signals? Do you think the international picture is important here?
Absolutely. And I think whilst I think you can view COPs through quite a negative lens in what are they actually achieving and be quite cynical about it, actually it's really important, because if we can get those international kind of agreements, that really can allow us here to push ahead and be a world leader again. And, you know, we've heard a lot over the years of, like, when we were in Glasgow, we all remember Rishi Sunak and his green chancellor's bag, green suitcase. What's it even called? Red box, green box. That kind of political stunt is meaningless. So I'm like really pleased that actually we have much deeper engagement going on with our front bench, going out there and being much more proactive on these issues. And I think that that's a clear signal that things are moving in the right direction, and actually we want to take ownership and kind of make sure that we're taking our responsibilities seriously. And I'm hoping that that will help with negotiations at both of the COPs that are coming up.
What are the key things that you would like to see happen during this Parliament? Are there things you're particularly passionate about that you want to see a Labour government do in its, you know, first term in office?
Yeah, I mean, I've long campaigned for more restoration of peatlands and valuable environments in the UK, whether that's forests and some of our sea beds that are really important for carbon capture and storage and kind of natural senses. Yeah. Our peatlands are so destroyed and are not doing the job that they should be doing, purely because we've mismanaged them and allowed them to go to rack and ruin by doing bad practices. And so one easy thing would be to stop moorland burning and strengthen the ban that the last government brought in, but also find and support skills in those areas as well, because we have like a shortage of people who can do those jobs at the minute. So it's a real crucial one that I would like to see more from a more holistic approach to this across government, rather than it just being falling on one department. It needs to be much more integrated. So I'm hoping that that will become kind of the bread and butter of what these missions kind of allow us to kind of push forward on. So we're not just focusing on energy jobs, we're focusing on nature jobs at the same time and things like that. So that's the real opportunity that we have at the moment, is to kind of change that and really focus on kind of protecting what we have and improving what we have, and not just sitting on our laurels and kind of hoping that things are going to get better without the action that we need to see.
What advice have you got for environmental campaigners and businesses that work on issues that aren't really recognised in Parliament? You know, so Green Alliance, you know, we do lots of work on resources and circular economy. We also do stuff on the transition that needs to happen with home heating. It's things like that that are maybe slightly less appealing if we're talking about adaptation. And there are loads of businesses as well as civil society that are really interested, but it doesn't get the airtime it deserves. What can we do about it?
I think just keep campaigning. I know everyone's exhausted.
Yeah. It's been a long year.
It's been a long year. I mean, it's been a long 10 years. It's been a lot going on. I'd quite like for us to have a boring period in politics, to be honest.
Me too.
So we can like fix the roof, you know, and some of the issues that we're facing are kind of a bit existential. And I think that's quite difficult to get people to understand here. So, you know, I'm a scientist by background. I get frustrated that there's not more of us. I'm not a climate scientist, I'm a biomedical scientist, but, you know, I want there to be more understanding of the science. And I think it's really important that people continue to talk about climate. I actually think nature connects really well with parliamentarians, because it's a concept that people can kind of understand a lot more. Like, you know, campaigns to save the hedgehog are going to go further than whether or not we have carbon credits, how we can make it real for parliamentarians as well. But I don't think all is lost. I think there's some really good people active on climate that have come into Parliament at the moment and have got that experience as campaigners themselves. So I think there's a lot of potential to see some champions for nature in Parliament this term, which is exciting. And yeah, hopefully we can actually raise the voice of nature and the environment and get more action.
Great. I hope you're right. Is there anything you particularly want to highlight that you're excited about the next 5 years?
I think there is a lot to be excited about. I think we can get a bit worn down by thinking about the here and now a bit too much. Like, we need to kind of see what the bigger vision is and kind of where we're going. And, you know, that is that 2030 target for energy transition. That is kind of thinking about what the art of the possible is for our landscapes and seeing what we can do to kind of protect them and develop understanding of the nature crisis that we have here. And, you know, we've kind of had a lost decade of inaction, really. So I'm just hoping that over the next 5 years, we'll see the opposite of that and hopefully see many, many small actions leading to a big outcome and not just kind of waiting for the silver bullet, which is kind of how it's felt over the last 10 years, that we're just waiting for something to come and save us. It's like, no, we've got to act now. And we're seeing that in the day-to-day of this Parliament so far. So I'm hoping that just continues and that there'll be good decisions, no matter how small, and that can make a big impact.
Thank you for listening to this Green Alliance podcast. Keep checking in as we will continue to bring you specialist interviews and highlights from our events here on your podcast feed. You can subscribe to the Green Alliance podcast on your favourite podcast app, and you can follow us at Green Alliance UK on X and Green Alliance on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. We encourage you to use the hashtag Green Alliance Podcast to join in on this conversation and share thoughts, questions and ideas. See you next time.